Now that I've moved all 6 ratios and created worksheets by year for year-specific data, calculated the medians at the bottom of each sheet for each year, now I want to create a new worksheet that reports only those median values that for by year. So let's start by adding a new sheet. Let's rename it to medians, because this is going to be our analysis of the median values for all the 6 ratios year by year. Start with 2014. I'm going to need a header field. So I'm going to come up to the top. In row 1, I'm going to select year through all of the variable names. Paste that into the median sheet. I can do Control V. Now I want to input the data. So come down to the bottom where my median values are, copy it, including the year name, select, Control C to copy, come to my medians. Now, if I were to paste with Control V, I'm going to get this message. This is an error message saying it doesn't understand what the references are. Why? Because I just pasted the formulas and not the actual values. So I'm going to come back, Control C, copy those 2014 values, formulas, and then on the medians tab, I want to select cell A2, and I want to do paste. So from the home screen, the home ribbon up top, paste, and paste the values, the clipboard with the numbers here. That says ignore the formulas, just paste those values in. And then we have no problem. Now we have our 2014 median values for each ratio. I'm going to repeat this for each of the following years. Highlight 2015's values, Control C to copy. Come over to the medians. I want my data to start in A3, paste, values. 2016. Now the format doesn't look great, so I'm going to select these numbers and choose number, and now it looks good. So what do I see here looking at this data? Net profit margin for this industry, regardless of time, it ranged between 3 and 5%. So about 3 to 5% of revenues end up as income after accounting for all expenses. That makes sense. Earnings per share ranges between 40 cents and a high of 55 cents. ROA was very consistent at the middle value level per year, median value per year. The return on assets has been consistently about 3%, or 3 cents for every dollar invested in assets, 3 cents is generated as income. ROE has ranged between 6% and 8%, return on equity 6% to 8%. The current ratio has ranged from the low of 1.84 to a high of 2.34. So we can say that they have almost 2 times or just over 2 times the amount of current assets to current liabilities. So this is a very liquid industry. And the debt to assets or liability to assets ratio has ranged from 0.43, which would be the year that it was the most solvent, or the least amount of liabilities to assets, to a high of 0.53. So if the company, this would say 53% would say that the company's assets were 53% of the company's assets were financed with liabilities. In this case, the remaining 47% of the assets were financed with equity. Okay, now that we have this data, let's put it in a little bit more of a better visual format. In order to do this, I can create the graphs, but it's going to be a little tricky with the data. What I like to do is reformat, similar to the way that I did when I did the totals, and I reformatted it to put my one variable per year at a time to create my graphs. Now, there might be other ways of doing this. I'm not saying this is the best way, but what I typically do is put the data, each variable on its own. So I'm going to copy my years several times so that I'm going to put these variables one at a time. So I want to have 6 groupings of the year. So now I have 4, 5, and I want to have those ratios one at a time next to year. So now I can do one of two things. I can copy earnings per share and paste it here in cell B8, or I can drag it. Once the data is highlighted, I can hover over the edge of it until my cursor becomes a plus sign, right click, and while I'm holding down the right click, I can drag it. Now, of course, another option. If I don't need, I can copy and paste. If I don't need the data to stay here in cell D, this ROA data in column D, if I don't need it, instead of Control C, what I can do is Control X. It looks like a copy, but when I come down to where I want to put the data in cell B15 and do Control V, it moves the data. It copies it, but it doesn't save the data in this original cell like Control C would do. Now, once I have my ratios over time in this format, it's really easy to generate my charts. Just like we did before, I'm going to insert, pull down to recommended charts, and I'm going to have charts for each ratio here. I'm going to use the same clustered column like I did before. I think this is a nice visual representation. So how does net profit margin look over time? Looks pretty good. I peaked at 2016, but still pretty, looks like overall a fairly good trend. How about earnings per share? Now, remember, net profit margin, earnings per share, ROA, and ROE are various measures, all very commonly used to look at how is the firm's performance. They all involve net income in their calculations, and net income is scaled in different ways. Okay, earnings per share doesn't look quite as great as net profit margin. So what does that tell us? Remember, net profit margin says what portion of those revenues become income. So net profit margin tells us something about how the revenues compare to expenses. Earnings per share tells us primarily about how does income compare to the number of shares outstanding. Now, of course, I ignored when I gave that little example or analysis of earnings per share. I ignored the preferred dividends. Remember, most companies don't have preferred dividends, so it typically doesn't have a major impact. So what can I see here with a kind of a small decline in earnings per share? Knowing that net income was pretty good, maybe perhaps the number of shares outstanding increased over the time. I don't know for sure, but it's giving. Let's look at ROA and see how. Remember, now ROA is saying how does net income compare to our change in assets? All right, it tells a similar story to earnings per share, but slightly different, because remember, equity can change in a way that's different from the change in assets. Now let's look at return on equity. This will tell us a little bit. This is somewhat similar to earnings per share. The difference is earnings per share, the denominator's number of shares outstanding, and ROE, the denominator equity, is total stockholders' equity from the balance sheet. Okay, so not too surprising that we're seeing somewhat similar trends. ROE looks fairly similar to earnings per share in terms of the overall trend. Now let's do a quick analysis of the company's liquidity and look at how that current ratio changed over time. Okay, nothing too different here. It's been very stable. The liquidity has been very stable. a small decline from 2014 to 2018, but still the absolute values of these numbers are still very high. So no concerns about this industry's liquidity. Remember, each time we're doing a chart, we want to make sure that we're starting with our selecting the first value in the first column. Remember, liabilities for assets is that one different ratio in the sense that the higher numbers are more concerning, and all other measures that we've looked at, higher numbers were better. Here, increases in the solvency in the liabilities to assets, it's not necessarily bad. As long as the debt that the company has is being used profitably, debt is being used to finance assets, and that those assets are being used to generate income, there's not a problem with having a large amount of debt. The problem is when debt is growing and income is not growing. That becomes a problem. That's when we're worried about the company's bankruptcy risk. But we can see here their liabilities to assets ratio is going up a little bit, but the company continues to be profitable. Or sorry, not the company, the industry continues to be profitable. So I don't see too many causes of concern. Now that concludes. The last item that I had the last thing I wrote on your instruction sheet was spend a few moments looking at these charts. How did the median values of performance, liquidity, solvency change over time? I just discussed that. Now you don't have to write this up. You don't have to choose any drop downs to discuss this. Taking a few minutes to reflect on the data is purely for your own benefit. Because remember, when we're looking at data, the goal is not just simply to produce charts or to follow a colleague's or boss's request. It's to actually make some sense out of the data. But there's no exact right or wrong, so I'm not going to ask you to write anything up. The purpose of this assignment was to get you comfortable with Excel and kind of introduce you to interpreting data. Once you're done here, you would save the data down for your industry and go to Blackboard and upload it in the Financial Analysis 2 with a link for your upload. And then your analysis is complete. I hope you enjoyed working on this project, and I hope you found it helpful.